We'll hear now from Páraic Kerrigan. You're getting your PhD at Maynooth at the moment, is that correct? Yeah. And I believe you're a John Hume scholar as well as the Irish Research Council?
Yes.
Well done. So we'll hear from Páraic and have questions again at the end, and I'll give you a sort of 5-minute wave when it's time, and another 1 minute, okay?
Okay, cool. So this project, similar to Don, is at the beginning. So I'm trying to work through contemporary Irish queer cinema and recent cinema that has been produced after the marriage equality referendum. So it's separate to my own PhD, so it's kind of the start of a new project. So any feedback at this point would be great. So I've only filtered down to 2 points for today. So to begin, in an essay on Irish cinema, Ruth Barton argues that one of the definitions crucial to understanding a national cinema in Ireland is its dialogue with the national culture. She later notes that the inherent drawback to the embrace of a collective culture is the rejection of its deviant identities. Among such identities noted by Barton is that of queer subjects, which for the most part had been largely absent from Irish cinema, with the exception of a handful of texts over the past 40 years or so. However, with the successful marriage equality referendum and the yes vote in that in 2015, there was an expansion in Irish nationhood to include gay and lesbian individuals as part of the national family. Notably since then, there has also been a queer turn, I would argue, within Irish cinema. 2016 saw the release of Darren Thornton's A Date for Mad Mary, and in 2017, actually this month, 2 weeks' time, John Butler will release his second film, Handsome Devil, and I just want to give an apology for this at this point. I've only seen the film once at the International Film Festival there a few weeks ago, but I've some analysis from that. So both these texts are centred around queer characters and narratives. One of the main concerns of this paper is to question how Irish cinema is beginning to map the cultural effects of the marriage equality referendum and the wider progressions in LGBT liberation that occurred in 2015. In doing so, I argue 2 main points. The first considers how the narrative of Handsome Devil on the right there, with all its emphasis on difference, ultimately concludes with the elimination of binaries and provides a post-gay resolution. Secondly, and with particular attention to Mad Mary, I argue that the formal aesthetics of cinema works towards a post-gay representational strategy. While these 2 films can be considered by what I argue to be a queer turn in contemporary Irish cinema, their varied aesthetic strategies and disparate political sensibilities introduce complexities that cannot be accounted for solely by a queer paradigm. And in fact, the mainstream economic and social imperatives that these films were produced in could arguably render these queer Irish cinema products as gay. So, post-gay even, sorry. So, queer Irish films over the past few years have been few and far between. There are some early examples in the 1980s that you can see on the left here. We have Colin Black's Pigs, and we have Joe Comerford's Reefer and the Model. And both of these texts interestingly engaged in an identity politics that questioned the perceived deviancy of gay people during that period. So it tried to reconfigure the stereotypes to a degree, I would argue. And then of course there's Neil Jordan's Crying Game, which I don't think really needs any introduction. It raised numerous questions around both gender and sexuality in Ireland, and arguably one of Ireland's most provocatively queer texts. And then Irish cinema produced during the Celtic Tiger witnessed a more pluralistic, multi-vocal film culture. And it saw an increase in the representation of socially excluded characters, among which included gays, lesbians and queers. And these were largely represented on both Goldfish Memory and Cowboys and Angels, which have been written on extensively. And Debbie Ging argues that these have recognisable aspects of the new Ireland that was forming during the Celtic Tiger, where there was an increase in affluence and the decline of religion resulted in the formation of a new sexual landscape where these more liberated sexualities could be articulated. In particular, both films convey queer characters adopting a consumerist guise, of course very much of its time in the Celtic Tiger, and to a greater extent it conveyed sexuality as a matter of choice. Since Cowboys and Angels in 2004, there have been queer characters in movies, but not necessarily any queer cinema produced in Ireland, with a notable change after the marriage equality referendum. And I think in that short space of time since 2015, we've had about 4 movies, Queen of Ireland, Viva, and then the 2 I'm talking about here. So I mean, that's a substantial increase in such a short space of time. So, much like debates around Irish cinema then, the academic terrain of queer cinema sees similar debates around defining what does a queer cinema mean, how far does it reach? So a useful definition, and one that helps towards a post-gay argument for queer Irish films, has been forwarded by Annette Pick. She declares that one problem with new queer cinema lies in the discourses of post-modernity, which hungrily appropriate marginal positions and redistribute them to a mainstream public. So an untimely pseudo-inclusiveness, one might argue, that importantly neutralises real differences. So this notion of neutralisation of differences is certainly apparent in A Day from Mad Mary, and more subtly so in Handsome Devil. This is unsurprising given the discourses surrounding the marriage equality referendum in Ireland, which also established a regime, I would argue, of neutralising difference. Oh, the slide's a bit off there, sorry about that. So, the marriage equality referendum and its cultural significance is only beginning to get unpacked academically and critically, but Anne Mulhall, following that, wrote quite a striking blog online, and she made some very good observations which I would tend to agree with. And she argued that for much of the referendum, the focus was on the personal, on family ties and friendship circles. The straight citizen public had to be persuaded not primarily of the economic logic involved in welding queer couples together with commitment, devices and forever love, but the sameness, and that's kind of the important part of what Mulhall says, the sameness of lesbian and gay love and family making. So in campaigning for a successful yes vote then, Mulhall argues that to make same-sex marriage appealing for a straight majority, the campaign had to appeal to the public sense of humanity through deconstructing the binaries of us versus them and forwarding a notion of sameness. Similarly, in both of these Irish films then, there is evidence to suggest that there are similar deconstructions happening as they attempt to address mainstream Irish audiences in the hope of ascertaining commercial success and wide distribution in cinemas. Economic imperatives such as these shape the presentation of queerness and also present what I argue to be a post-gay sensibility. So I've mentioned this word post-gay several times now, so I think it's about time to define it for you all. So what exactly do I mean by this? Post-gay was a concept forwarded by Alan Sinfield in the late 1990s, an academic, quite a prominent queer academic, who was becoming frustrated with what he referred to as the apparent complacency of queer communities, particularly following, well not even following, during the HIV and AIDS crisis. So he argues that gay people are now so firmly embedded within the fabric of day-to-day life in modern society that gay sexualities are rendered acceptable, normalised, unremarkable, and simply part of the contemporary terrain of social life. LGBT activists throughout particularly the 70s, 80s, traditionally constructed a collective identity using an oppositional us versus them as part of their identity politics, when they were strategically trying to deploy differences from heterosexuals and trying to achieve liberation and other kind of policy norms. So what happens when activists seek to emphasise their similarities to straights, as they are motivated to do during a post-gay moment? Much like the neutralisation of differences that was evident in the campaign for a yes vote, post-gay argues that gay people are now firmly embedded within the fabric of day-to-day life in modern Ireland, and that gay sexuality are accepted, normalised and unremarkable. Being gay in the present moment does not then mean that much at all, and it's characterised, I would argue, by assimilation and our respectability politics. So we have good gays that, you know, don't have sex with each other and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the ideal that's produced. So the premise of both of these films are significantly different and map queer sexualities in varying ways. However, the plots are centred around the conventional coming-of-age story, but in significantly different settings and with different post-gay outcomes. So A Day from Mad Mary depicts Mad Mary McArdle as she returns to her hometown of Drogheda after a brief stint in prison. She's out in time to act as maid of honour at her best friend Charlene's wedding, but finds that while she was inside, things have changed. Specifically, Charlene, who has reinvented herself from the previous tough girl into a social climber. So as Mary tries to reconcile with Charlene's newly discovered bourgeois values, she searches for a +1 to a wedding, but instead finds herself becoming friendly with Jess, the wedding videographer, and thus a romance ensues between the two. A Day from Mad Mary is significant, not only for the obvious choice as it actually positions a queer woman at the centre of a narrative, which was largely absent. The Goldfish Memory dealt with this to some degree, but this is kind of the first one where a woman is placed at the centre of a text, and that was quite pivotal. But also a queer working class woman, because sexuality and working class representations in Ireland have largely never been kind of associated with each other or put together. So that was kind of interesting representational strategy. So lesbian is only used once in the film, and the word lesbian that is, and for the most part queer sexualities seem to have been incorporated seamlessly into the Drogheda context in which it is set without any question whatsoever. So in a significant departure from A Day from Mad Mary then, Handsome Devil positions itself amongst the higher echelons of the social ladder, as it is based in a private school of Woodhill College. The premise of the plot is again the conventionally well-worn scenario of a young boy in a private school setting. The plot is narrated through the voice of the main protagonist Ned, who is on the left of that screen grab there. And he is an effete sensitive musician subjected to much ridicule from the masculine-fueled environment of the school's rugby team. It is when Ned is forced to share a room with the new boy Connor, who becomes, on the right there, who becomes the star out half on the rugby team, that the film deviates, or at least attempts to do so, from the conventional coming-of-age narrative, as Connor, the rugby star, tries to reconcile his sexuality with his very public masculine persona within the school. So interestingly, a post-gay rhetoric is evident from the promotion and marketing of both of these movies. The director Darren Thornton, in an interview for Totally Dublin just prior to the release of A Day for Mad Mary, implies a de-gayness of gay identity in an interview, when he suggested that being gay in the present moment doesn't really mean much at all. We never thought of it as a gay film or a straight film, he says. We thought of it as a film about girls and their relationships. As long as you understand someone, can empathise with them on some level, then you can go anywhere. According to Thornton then, A Day for Mad Mary evokes a kind of postmodern identity, in which the old-fashioned category of sexuality has been rendered meaningless, overridden by the recognition of a transcendental essential humanity, which cannot be reduced to specificities of ethnicities or sexual orientation. And again, the movie trailer, if any of you have seen that prior to its release, gives this point even more credence, as it suggests that the narrative will follow the conventional heteronormative romantic comedy plot. So there is no mention in that trailer whatsoever of the fact that Mary is going to strike up a relationship with a woman. More strikingly, a post-gay politics is then evident with an interview that John Butler did for GCN, Gay Community News, where he states that Handsome Devil is all about rejecting forms of binary definition, the idea of being true to oneself rather than picking a side and defining yourself as one thing or another. Again, an attempt to neutralise difference, I would argue. So even the trailer for Handsome Devil, and that even more so has queer subjects at the centre of its plot, completely eliminates any reference to any kind of gay identity or gay struggles whatsoever. I would argue quite problematically so. So to look at Handsome Devil firstly then, on the surface, Butler's film resists a post-gay definition, with queer identities being constructed in the text through difference in binary oppositions at the beginning, which are articulated at various points, both thematically and stylistically. For one, we see opposing masculinities between Pascal, the rugby coach, on the top left here, and then Dan Sherry, the English teacher. And then, of course, we see a contrast of gay versus straight with both Connor and Ned then as well. This notion of opposition and division is underpinned by a Berlin Wall, which is constructed by Ned to separate him from Connor so he can prevent any relationship or friendship striking up between the two. And even the way the movie is edited, I couldn't get any screenshots because it's still not released yet, but it has a yellow line that comes up and splits the screens constantly into two, so there's this whole, it's pushing forward this whole notion of binaries and differences constantly. So even stylistically and formally, it's adopted that approach. So again, in an interview with the Irish Times, Butler again emphasises the binaries and that this was quite deliberate, referring to them as deeply unhelpful when you're growing up. He says he knows that sounds like a fridge magnet, but that these definitions need to be done away with. So again, Butler's rhetoric is attempting to position Handsome Devil within a post-gay moment, as he completely tries to break down barriers of difference between gay and straight. In fact, much of Handsome Devil actually aims to destroy the modes of difference in the text, particularly by the conclusion. So it does have some queer issues at its heart that does need to be notified, particularly in a way that contests a classification as post-gay. The text is centred for a large part around homophobic bullying, particularly that visited on Ned, who is perceived as gay because he likes the creative arts, of course. And throughout we see him being subjected to various homophobic slurs such as queer and bender, with there generally being no repercussions for the bullies. On discovering Connor's sexuality, rugby coach Pascal, and Connor is, just to remind you, the rugby star who actually is gay, on discovering Connor's sexuality, rugby coach Pascal refuses to allow him to play on the team in the final, despite the fact that this would notably cost the school the game. So this blatant homophobia is combated directly in the film's climax, when Connor's teammates decide to overlook the fact that he is gay and stand in solidarity with him against Pascal, the rugby coach. Similarly, Pascal embodies a very aggressive right-wing attitude when he discovers that Dan, the English teacher, is also gay and attempts to get him let go from the school. And tries to persuade the principal to do so, but ultimately fails. So although still a very vital contemporary social issue, this is as far as the homophobic narrative goes within the text. And although experiences of homophobia are not totally eradicated from this film, it becomes undermined by the conventional neat conclusion that this text offers, and I would argue favours a post-gay sensibility. So following the team's standoff with Pascal and joining Connor, he's allowed to play the game again, and his intervention results in the school winning the game. And as a result, it is by winning the game that apparently all of the homophobia is just lifted from the text, and Connor is easily just assimilated into the social order with no question to his sexuality after that then, despite this very blatant homophobia before that. So this resolution is and conventional inclusion is quite problematic for queer subjectivities. So that's Butler's movie. So then I'm going to get a bit more techie here with A Day for Mad Mary, as I think there's some very interesting aesthetic strategies being used by Thornton in this film regarding how queer intimacy is framed. So, not too sure if any of you are familiar, but Ireland's also always had an issue, particularly TV and film productions, of portraying intimacy. And Fair City famously almost had the near gay kiss in 1996, but the characters got interrupted before they were about to go in for the clinch. So we've often had a problem with framing this. So, and just to give you some background, Handsome Devil, although full of about two gay characters, they never have any intimate moments whatsoever. And any intimate acts are marked off screen. English teacher Dan Sherry actually has a boyfriend, and he for the most part remains silent, and if he was not named as the boyfriend, he would have just been obscured as another extra. Similarly, Connor enters the gay bar at one point, and two men are in the foreground of the shot, completely blacked out, but visibly kissing, but blacked out so you can't really make it out. So again, this is quite problematic as well. But Mad Mary would seem like a significant departure then, because regularly we see Jess and Mary share numerous kisses on screen. In one instance, Mary kisses Jess outside of the church. But we only ever see their lips touch because the shot from this establishing mid-shot changes and focuses on Charlene and Leona's reaction. And by the time it returns back to Mary and Jess, their lips have parted. So we've actually missed the kiss completely. We see them move in for the clinch, and then it separates for about 5 seconds for the reaction for Charlene and Leona. But more importantly then, I would argue, the queer intimacy comes from Mary and Jess's first kiss. So following waking up in a hotel room, a series of medium close-ups follow that see Mary kiss Jess and Jess then reciprocate. Much of the kiss is shot through a medium close-up over Jess's shoulder, obscuring any visible kissing. So you can see Jess's shoulder here is kind of obscuring their mouths touching. And following this, they both lay in the bed, and the camera looks up from them and see we can make out what's happening, but it's not showing it full on, and it obscures any sort of intimacy were it not for the sound. So the camera returns briefly to Mary and Jess kissing, and literally for about, I think, 2 seconds before it cuts away to the next day with them both sitting awkwardly on a bus. So any sort of queer encounter that these two will have is left entirely to the imagination. So depicting queer intimacy then could be argued as indicating the liberal leanings of text and Irish film more broadly. But when examining the camera angles, the editing and the proxemic patterns, they tell a more cautious story. The shot selection in this scene arguably works towards mitigating the perceived messiness of representing queer intimacy, and I argue attempts to de-gay the film, be it deliberately or not. The formal strategies thus work towards a post-gay politics of maintaining our respectability that I mentioned earlier, and the homonormativity, that gay people can recuperate the social norms of heteronormative straight society. And I argue that this is done to appeal to a mainstream audience and thus refusing to go all the way with the gay, as I would argue. So, as I work towards a conclusion then, as I attempt to anyway, what is evident from both of these texts is that although they produce queer characters in overt and open ways that has not necessarily been seen with previous Irish cinema, they both fail to upset the heterocentric, consumption-friendly flow of mainstream Irish cinema. The representation of queer characters in these instances arguably conforms to the demands of a commercial medium steeped in a heterocentric genre formula, filtered by marketing to reach the most lucrative consumers and targeted to the interests of mostly heterosexual viewers. The post-marriage equality context of these queer films occurs in a moment where the changing political landscape and cultural position of gays and lesbians has destabilised many of the mechanisms that have undergirded a specific regime of sex and gender. So in doing so, I would argue that these texts present an overtime acceptance of mainstream cultural norms by those who were once revolutionaries. So to conclude, a post-gay representational strategy in politics brings with it some problematic traps, and most of which I'm still attempting to work through and kind of make into some sort of coherent argument. Significantly, it eliminates difference that defines queer communities at the expense of mainstream commercial appeal. Not that this paper is trying to make the universal claim that we are currently living in a post-gay moment, which we're not. I mean, if we look at mental health surveys of LGBT people in Ireland, particularly young people, we still have a lot of work to do, and particularly with politics, gay politics in Russia at the moment. There's some very problematic work that has to be done. But the narrative and formal features of these films in particular would suggest that we are potentially considering a post-gay Irish cinema rather than a queer Irish cinema. So thank you very much.